Good morning and welcome everyone. For those who are online with us, thank you all for being here today. My name is Menin and I'm from Brazil, but today we're going to talk about Colombia. Well, Colombia is a beautiful country, as you can see by this photo. And I had the opportunity to live there in 2021 and 2022. And I had always dreamed about living in Colombia, fun fact, because I really wanted to learn how to dance bachata and salsa. And after this period living in Colombia, one thing that I can say for sure is that dancing is definitely not one of my skills. So anyways, when I was living there, I was working and living in an active conflict zone, working with the United Nations to verify the living conditions and the situation of former guerrilla communities after they signed a peace agreement in 2016. So after this period, I was living there, and that complex context, I was trying to understand, and I applied to be a Rotary Peace Fellow, in fact, several times, right, Susan? Thank you. Because I really wanted to better understand that reality that I was experiencing. So after 2 years studying at Duke and UNC, focusing in conflict, peace, development, today I have a better understanding of why that peace agreement that was signed between the Colombian government and the former guerrilla is not working. Just a disclaimer, many pictures or photos that you're going to see here today, they're mine. And I was instructed to tell when I'm portrayed in the pictures. Hopefully that will get me a job. So just a bit of a historical background for us to understand and to talk about it today. Colombia, a country in South America, has a population of 44 million people. And a specific moment in Colombia's history was between around 1930s and 1958. There was a period in Colombia called La Violencia, or the violence. It was a bloody period, a fight between the conservative political party and the liberal political party. They were fighting for power. And in 1958, they reached an agreement, a political agreement. However, this political agreement did not consider important portions of the population in Colombia, meaning rural peasants, students, communists, left-wing influencers, and more. So this portion of the population started making pressure on the government to attend their agenda, for example, land reforms. The government not listening to them and repressing this portion of the population. So this portion of the population, they decided to go to arms and they formed guerrillas. And the most important one is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. In Spanish, its acronym is FARC. So after this period, over the years, these guerrillas, they established themselves in rural areas of Colombia, in remote areas. And around the 1980s, paramilitary groups were created, backed by hard right-wing politicians and Colombian elites to fight against these guerrillas and to protect properties and land owners, right? Over time, unfortunately, these guerrillas, they left behind their ideologies and they resorted to drug trafficking to fund their activities. But that also happened with the paramilitary groups resorting and relying on drug trafficking to fund their activities. So with time in Colombia, well, assassinations, massacres, kidnappings, extortion, bombings, minefields, you name it, started to become the reality in the country because of the conflicts among the guerrillas and the paramilitary groups. So if you add on top of that, the government armed forces, that the conflict was generalized and Colombia was immersed in a full civil war. In the pictures here, in the photos, you can see on the top right, the FARC army in 1999. The picture on the bottom right, there's a woman in the lines of FARC, and on the bottom right too, the lines and the army of the paramilitary groups. So just so you have a notion, after 50 years of war, from 1964 to 2016, when the peace agreement was signed, these are the numbers, and they are terrifying. More than 7 million people displaced because of the conflicts. That represents 15% of the population. So more than 50,000 deaths. Oh, actually kidnappings, I'm sorry. And there are 450,000 deaths. And it's estimated that 80% of that is of civilians. So just for you to have a notion of the proportion of the war, it's estimated that only FARC had more than 20,000 soldiers. It was an army. Well, in 2016, Colombia, the government of Colombia, after many years of negotiations with FARC, and after many attempts of peace agreements with guerrillas, they reached an agreement in Panama. You can see the picture on the top left. They're represented by the former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, the FARC leaders, and also in the picture you can see Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of Colombia, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, I'm sorry. So this was a big deal at the time, and it was considered a success. Juan Manuel Santos, the president, won a Nobel Peace Prize, and the country had hopes to finish this period. So this peace agreement brought important considerations about restorative and transitional justice, about transition of illicit crops, substitution of illicit crops, and many other aspects important to the conflict. But also it brought a step-by-step considering demobilization of former combatants, disarmament of former combatants, as you can see by the picture of the United Nations on the top right, and reintegration of former combatants. So this reintegration is the most important part of this peace agreement. And it brought the government committed to promote the reintegration, the social reintegration, the political reintegration, and the economic reintegration of these former combatants, all guaranteeing their security. So it was an important thing, as I said, and two important points are in this moment to highlight here so we can keep going. There were many guerrillas, active guerrillas in Colombia at the time, right? Not only FARC, but FARC was the largest one, the oldest one, and the one that the government struggled the most. That's why the peace agreement was only with FARC. Also, not all of the former FARC combatants agreed to sign this agreement. So as you remember, I mentioned it was estimated that they were like around 20,000 former combatants on FARC. Around 13,000 agreed to sign the agreement. The other part of it, either they went to other guerrilla groups or they created splintered groups. So after 8 years, we're in 2024, how do you think Colombia is now? Unfortunately, I don't have good news. From my firsthand experience in working and living in the state of Cauca in Colombia, the state is not present in the territories, right? And that's the most important problem here today. These communities, and here not only the former FARC communities, but also the rural population in Colombia, they lack access to basic services that the government should be providing. They don't have access to education. They don't have access, or restricted access, let's be fair, to education, to health, to jobs, to opportunities, to economic development. And here you can see the picture, this photo on the bottom left. We were visiting a community school, and the school was closed, and we were talking with the community leader. She was explaining to us that at the time they had received a donation of computers, and they were all locked in a room. They didn't have access to that. Unfortunately, that was the reality. This photo on the bottom right, you can see a basic health facility, and it was also closed. And the local villagers, they said that from time to time, someone would open it and assist the population, but they never knew when, how, who. So there is no presence of state institutions in those territories in Colombia, meaning the population has either restricted or no access to these basic services, no opportunities, there's no economic development, so they're left in limbo with no dignity. Okay, Chris. But then, well, you're talking about development, you're talking about the situation of the population in rural areas. What about security? So they signed a peace agreement, they handed over all their guns, so they're all safe, right? Unfortunately, no. So because of this long period of war, there are many grievances of this period. So all these former guerrillas, the dissident groups of guerrilla that came from FARC and dissident paramilitary groups, they're still very active in these zones. They're conflicting because of fighting for territory control over to profit out of illicit activities, right? And not only illicit crops, but illicit activities. So this provokes a lot of violence and still a lot of violence and killing of signatories of those peace agreements. And because of these conflicts that are still going on, this still provoking mass displacements of rural populations. So this photo on the top right, you can see I took it in a gym in a local community, and all these people, they got displaced. It was an emergency situation coordination among NGOs and the local town hall and public authorities, because they were in a conflict. They had to flee their homes and leave everything behind, and they never knew that happened on a weekly basis. And they never knew when they came to this gym, when they would be able to go back, when the conflict would be over. So it could take days, it could take weeks. Unfortunately, that was the reality. The photo on the bottom right, you can see it's a town hall. And I had a meeting there. And the day before the meeting, a guerrilla exploded a car bomb and exploded the whole building. So that, unfortunately, is the reality of the violence in Colombia. And a side effect of that is that those peace agreement signatories that accepted to hand over their guns, and they were expecting or trusting the government, they have no economic and job opportunities, and they also have no protection. So they have to provide for their families, and they have to look for their protection. So what's happening now, some of those signatories, they are going back to the guerrillas. So they're going back to arms, and the conflict never ends. It's a cycle. So I ask you today, is there peace in Colombia? What did this peace agreement achieve? Was it worth it for this former FARC communities and combatants? Well, I don't have an answer to that, but certainly there's a lot of work to do on this. So, okay, Chris, you talked a lot. We understand after going all through this context, and it's a very complex context that doesn't have only one answer or one factor. What would be the possible alternatives? So one thing that the government is doing today, for example, the current government is trying to make peace agreements with other guerrilla groups, right? That would be reasonable. However, it doesn't address the root causes of the situation. I mean, if the government cannot commit and provide with the commitments that it did in 2016, how can it offer more and more promises to other groups and other portion of the population, right? So I believe that one factor that is actually already provided in the peace agreement is the locally development programs called territorially focused development programs. So is that the government, a policy that the government provide basic services to local communities in the rural areas, but also invest in these locally led development programs, providing economic opportunities, job opportunities, and infrastructure. You can see that this photo on the bottom right is one of the roads that I had to work and go to visit these little towns. That's the situation. So for example, these other two pictures are small-scale projects that former guerrilla communities, they were producing coffee and fish production. But how are they going to use and take this production to other places going through these roads, right? So it's not feasible, and there's no, it doesn't promote the local development. If the government doesn't have the capacity or this presence in the field, in the territory, it should be integrated with the private sector. Bring the private sector in, bring international community, make partnerships with local NGOs, international NGOs, but make it feasible, make it happen. So I believe that this peace agreement that was signed in Colombia, I understand it is a role model to other conflicts around the world. And more than anything, I believe in peace. However, the government must be invested on it and must be creative too. And I hope And I believe that those communities, especially these former combatant communities, can feel safe, as you can see in this picture. And one day, they can have the life that they once dreamed of when they signed a peace agreement. Thank you.